Adelaide.
Aline Hinder from the EU delegation trade section. Thank you very much. We're all sifting through the TPP and learning more every day about the details. I have one question for Jean and one question for Derek. So on the procurement side, this question of offset, how can you actually monitor that 40% that Vietnam is not going to go further than 40% of its total procurement value? Does it assume that every company will report exactly the kind of contracts they have and how it's implemented? I mean, it seems difficult knowing how hard it is to get data on procurement and on contracts. So wondering if you have thoughts on that. And to Derek, there is this interesting provision in the SOE's chapter indicating that while sub-federal level is not covered for current participants, it should be covered for future participants. It's hard to negotiate with the Chinese, I'm sure, but wondering what are your thoughts on that? And it's certainly an interesting innovation in terms of how you do leaving agreements.
Well, the question on how to monitor the use of offsets is a good question. And I don't know if the parties have thought through how that's going to be done, because there's always a question whether they have sort of, I don't think in the agreement there's anything that says they have to report to the other parties how they're using it. So generally what happens on procurement issues is you wait for the people, for the companies in the market to say, we think too much is being excluded, or there's too much being set aside, or we don't want, the requirements are a problem, and then the governments can raise the issues. But I think that's an issue that I'm guessing they haven't actually addressed in any particular provision.
Yeah, I understand that you can't snap your fingers and bring subnational entities under the TPP rules, and you'd have to have long phasing periods, and I get that. That's not, of course, what they did. What they did was say, we're going to punt this, and in the future it will be better. I'm very suspicious of that kind of claim, and I would put it to supporters of TPP. The president said rightly, and this is a good thing, 18,000 taxes, that's tariffs or taxes, 18,000 taxes are going to be cut in the TPP. What if he had said, we recognize that tariffs are bad, and in the future, we're going to cut lots of tariffs? You really wouldn't put much stock in that. And so it's very difficult to put a lot of stock in. In the future, we'll have an actual agreement on SOEs that will be better. The answer is you should do it now. This is going to set the precedent for TTIP, for TISA talk, for a lot of different things. And you're setting a precedent that says, I don't want to do it, it's hard, maybe we'll do it later. So, I don't mean to impugn anyone's honesty, but all the people who negotiated this, not all of them, but most of the people who negotiated this agreement won't be negotiating the agreement later where we make it better. And I find this, I don't find it reassuring that that's the way they approach the issue.
Hello. Oh, thanks to the panel. First of all, it's really a fascinating discussion. I'm Eric Altor. I'm an independent business consultant. I have a question on rules of origin for Nicole. There was a question raised earlier about automobile rules of origin, and you may want to touch on that, but I have a follow-on question to that about textile and apparel rules of origin. And you rightly note that these are basically unchanged from the NAFTA. They are uniquely restrictive and very complicated based upon a yarn-forward triple transformation rule of origin. And when you look at the history of how trade has operated under these rules, you really see no real growth in new trade or investment under a yarn-forward rule of origin. It's been a frustration for those in the industry. When you look at automobiles are actually subject to a rule that most other goods are, and there's always a tension in rules of origin between number one, promoting trade, and number two, ensuring that those parties outside the agreement don't benefit to any great degree. And with textiles and apparel, that has been the overriding consideration to keep particularly China out of the value chain under the TPP textile and apparel rules. So my question for Nicole is how do we get past this from a 20th century rule of origin for textiles and apparel into something that's really going to work for modern value chains and to promote trade and investment? Is a regional value content rule an easier, a way to achieve the policy objectives as far as ensuring that the benefits go to members, while at the same time simplifying enforcement and compliance, which under complicated rules of origin can be extraordinarily expensive and essentially negate the benefits of the agreement?
Well, I'm thankful for the TPP and the rules of origin because it keeps people like me fully employed. So, I mean, I'll just say that straight up. With respect to the automobiles, is our friend who asked the question still here? Okay. So the question is, when we look at the rules of origin, it appears that the value content requirements have gone down, and so therefore aren't we allowing third-party or non-party countries to participate in the FTA? And the answer is, again, I go back to the global value sourcing chain, global value chain. And what's happened is the companies who are invested in the United States and Canada and Mexico are sourcing more inputs globally. And so when you're doing that, and it's because countries are becoming more specific in what they're able to produce, and so it's going to that country to produce the belts that are used on your seat belt. It's going to another country to produce the type of material that goes into making mufflers and keeping them quiet. And so as countries become more specialized and you realize there's no need for everybody to have that type of plant in their country, you source more globally. And I think that it actually benefits the companies, the large manufacturers, from that standpoint, in that they are able to maximize, so that the companies who are located within the TPP partners, even though their value requirement seems to be smaller, net value, because they'll be able to produce more, is going to be greater. You understand what I'm saying? On the textiles and apparel, that's one of my pet peeves. We've had the same rule of origin since 1994. It has not changed. For those of you who don't know, it requires that your yarn has to be spun or extruded. So you've got a little your spinning wheel out there, and you're doing that into the cotton to make it into the yarn. Then you have to weave it, or you have to knit it into the fabric. Then you have to cut it, and you have to sew it, and you have to finish it, and you have to embroider it, and you have to dye it in a country in order to get the benefit. It's ridiculous. You look at any other chapter, any other product, it does not have that rule of origin. If you're going to make this microphone, you don't have to have the metal that's in here being made in the country, as well as the electronics and the wires and the parts and the pieces and the plastic. You don't. You take the metal that comes from one chapter, you take the plastic that comes from another chapter, you take another, you put them together, boom, you got it. And that means this came from China, this came from India, and the inputs came from Brazil, but it was made in the United States. That's how it works. And this perception that you're giving benefits to a non-party, it's not the case, because the person who, or the entities that are benefiting, are those that are in the country that are able to make the goods. And how do we get around it? Regional value content would be definitely preferable. It can be enforced. It has been enforced. It's enforced with the Israel agreement. It's enforced with a lot of our GSP agreements, and the government's been able to do it. So to say you can't do it on one product, but you can do it on everything else, is ridiculous. So I hope that we do reform eventually.